Now we have a wonderful panel for the next hour featuring Professor Suny, who's already spoken, but it's my great honor to present Professor Sheila Fitzpatrick to us, who's going to be with us throughout the symposium. And this is her first time on a symposium, so a big welcome to her. She is a historian of modern Russia and 20th century migration, who's currently Professor of History at the Institute for Humanities and Social Sciences, Australian Catholic University, Melbourne, Honorary Professor at the Universities of Sydney and Melbourne, and Distinguished Service Professor Emeritus at the University of Chicago. And some of her most recent books include Spy in the Archives from 2013, On Stalin's Team, The Years of Living Dangerously in Soviet Politics from 2015, Mishka's War, A European Odyssey of the 1940s from 2017, and White Russians, Red Peril, A Cold War History of Migration to Australia from a few years ago, 2021, and The Shortest History of the Soviet Union. Now, Professor Fitzpatrick is also writing and will be publishing a new book, Lost Souls, Soviet Displaced Persons and the Birth of the Cold War, which will be published by Princeton University Press in November, and we're delighted to have her with us. So if we could give her a warm welcome.
Well, thank you. You got in practically everything, but I will still give a plug for another thing of mine that's in press called Death of Stalin, and that's coming in 2025, and that was that was even shorter than The Shortest History, but this was actually looking at the death of Stalin and its consequences, but to some degree in the light of the Nյութի film, so it was really fun to do. Okay, so let me start off with class and nationality in a context of the Russian Revolution. And as I prepared some remarks on this topic, I remembered that an awful long time ago, Ron and I had an argument. You remember that? You're looking innocent as if you didn't. But this must have been about 1980. It's before all that, the 1983 books on construction of nationality came out. And I published an article. I was already working on upward mobility. I had noticed this. I didn't come in to work on upward mobility, but I had noticed in connection with my dissertation on education policy, I had noticed that this was a phenomenon, and I was thinking, what is it all about? And that led me to look at the question of class in the context of the Bolsheviks and the Russian Revolution, and brought me to the discussion of 1920-21, a very bitter discussion in which the Bolsheviks essentially were faced by the fact that they had taken power in the name of the proletariat, and the proletariat had apparently disappeared out from under them, and so that their enemies started to say, permit us to congratulate you on being the vanguard of a non-existent class. Anyway, so I wrote about that, and Ron didn't like that, and wrote a rebuttal in, I think it was Russian Review. Ron, he didn't, well, I shouldn't paraphrase you too much, but basically this was this was from a position of somebody who, with a strong commitment to labor history and to a Marxist view of the importance of the proletariat and the Bolshevik connection with it, which I was in a sense challenging. Now, what I think I was, I'm not sure that I realized that at the time, but I was a sort of social construction of class before my time, so to speak. As I say, we are now in about 1980. And so what I'm going to talk to you today, it's really, it's these same ideas that I was developing in those years that have stuck with me and been refined to some extent. So our revolutions are supposed to be about changes in power relations, which are perhaps structural, perhaps simply about changing the people at the top, but they also change individual lives and life chances in myriad ways. So every Russian or Soviet who wrote a memoir of this period later would write it with references to the great milestones before the revolution, after the revolution, before the revolution. And then you have before collectivization, after collectivization, especially for the people directly connected. And then, of course, before the war, after the war. And then we've got a final one now, before the collapse of the Soviet Union, after. So that's so you construct your narrative on the basis of these milestones or these watershed events, and one of the reasons that you do that is that what the effect that they have on you as an individual is to require a certain degree of self-reinvention. In other words, you need a self to cope, or you need a self to operate in the new circumstances. And I mean, like any kind of construction of self, this builds on what you might call real biographical facts, but it also makes very liberal use of them, and to an extent can also involve outright falsification, but is by no means equivalent to falsification. It's in part a matter of bringing up the things about you that will fit the circumstance that you're in. I mean, just as a very simple example, when I went to the Soviet Union as a graduate student in the 1960s, I went on the British exchange, and therefore I didn't often go around to saying to Russians, I am Australian, although I was Australian by birth, because it complicated the story. It was obvious I was British, sort of, yeah, because I'm on the British exchange. And then when I went to America, to a degree, I kept that up because people would congratulate me on my cute British accent. And I mean, you know, to say, well, actually I'm Australian, that's forcing a whole anyway, whatever. So you to agree to a degree, you go with what fits and what makes things easiest. Now, with regard to the October Revolution and to the establishment of Soviet power, one of the big changes for the individual was a sudden centrality of class. Now, there had been, of course, people interested in class before. Intellectuals were interested in class. Marx was a powerful influence on the intellectuals. But ordinary people were not particularly. They were accustomed, when they had to identify themselves in terms of a social status, to do it by сословие, by that is the social group that you hold, to which you are assigned by birth, which defines your rights and obligations to the state. And your rights and obligation will be different from that of people in other soslовия. Now, the class definition was, on the face of it, a totally different thing. The classes that you were operating with were, for example, proletariat, an unfamiliar word and concept, although, of course, people knew working class, bourgeois, kulak, Bidnyak, the various subcategories of what had been a common category of peasant, poor peasants, and so on. So these categories suddenly become central in not just politically. It's not just a matter of the party that has taken power saying they represent the proletariat, although that is an important part of it. But there's the question for the social historian of what does that mean to individuals. And one of the things it means is that all kinds of, that you will be regarded conventionally and also in terms of documents in your file self, you will have a class category. You will be put into a class category, such as proletarian, or kulak, and that category will either help or hinder your life chances. If you're proletarian, there are all kinds of circumstances after the revolution in which you basically say, well, look, I'm a proletarian, I'm a member of the now dictator class, and so I should have priority. And the opposite is true of your kulak. In kulak, you're by definition suspect. Now, I've been talking about individuals, but let's switch back to the Bolshevik Party, which now is the ruling party, is pushing is imposing this class categorization of the population. And why they are doing it is to make the population, in James Scott's term, legible to them. In other words, to know who people are. And the Bolsheviks' approach was that if you belong to some social classes, proletariat, poor peasantry, you are ipso facto likely to be a supporter of the revolution. But if you belong to other categories such as bourgeois landowner, kulak, or clergy, which they counted as a class, you are ipso facto likely to be an opponent of the revolution, regardless of what you as an individual said about yourself, thought about yourself, or even did. The fact of your membership of this class makes you objectively, if not an active class enemy, at least a potential one. Now that objective, that categorization of the categories as objective was very important to the Bolsheviks. They saw themselves as approaching things scientifically. They felt that the ways in which they tried to make the population legible were scientific, which is another way of saying they were modern. They thought that the Russian imperial ways of trying to make the population legible in the, for example, the 1897 census, using religion and social estate, these were outmoded. These no longer applied to the modern age, whereas to identify people in terms of class and nationality, our topic today, this was the modern way of doing it. Now, because the Bolsheviks think some classes are naturally produce allies and others naturally produce enemies, there are institutional structures they put in place to respond to this. And the first, one of the best known, is class justice. In other words, when you're before the courts, there is the question of your individual guilt and so on, but there is also the question of your class membership. And if you're a proletarian who has committed a minor a crime like theft, this is from the point of view of any sentence, this is way less offensive than if you are a class enemy who are on top of that, commits some crime. So there's class justice, but there's also the practice of what, when I started working on this, was not called affirmative action, but which now is. In other words, giving preference to class allies both in access to higher education and secondary education and technical education, all along the line in education, and also on the job in promotion strategy. Выдвижение was the Russian way of, there wasn't a concept there because it's not a Marxist concept. The Bolsheviks didn't have a way of talking about, so they use that rather inadequate word, выдвижение, but that means affirmative action on behalf of both class allies and on the national front of backward nationalities who need the state's help, but that's slightly different in terms of its ideological underpinning. Now, one of the problems, to go back to that article of mine about the proletariat as a disappearing class, one of the problems is that after the revolution, the actually existing class structure is in great disarray because of the revolution and civil war itself, in large part. One of the things that it had done was almost at a stroke, remove the big capitalists, because so many of them were foreign, and that's actually the war had already done a great deal of that. So big capitalists to a large extent suddenly disappeared. Landowners have been expropriated in a spontaneous way, so okay, that's one class gone. Service nobility is gone. Now, what about the proletariat? Now, one of the things that happened, that disappearance of the proletariat that was so evident in 2021, it was in part a temporary phenomenon. It was in part because of the hungry cities. Workers are fleeing, factories not working, so you go home. But it also made very clear that an awful lot of the factory workers are in fact first-generation proletarians who still have a family in the village. In other words, when they leave the city, they have somewhere to go, and there is some land attached to it. There is a possibility of living. So naturally, they did that. But that too, however, is a problem for the Bolsheviks in that they had hoped that their proletariat was a proletariat that had liberated itself from these ties to the land. With this class structure in disarray in the 1920s, you have, to some extent, of course, a process of reformation of actual classes. In other words, the proletarians, the workers who went to the villages come back, most of them, when jobs open up again. And of course, other people, there's a large-scale movement of peasants into the working class, which is therefore greatly expanded at the end of the 20s. So all of that is part of a process of reformation, if you like to put it, of the proletariat. You also have the construction of new class categories, notably kolkhoznik, because collectivization, and there had been members of collective farms before, small numbers, and who called themselves kolkhozniki. But as a major social class, this simply didn't exist. But it does after the intervention of the Soviet state. So there's a certain amount of class formation that is going on, but there is also notably some class destruction going on, liquidation of classes. This is in the first five-year plan period, the early Stalin period at the end of the 1920s. Along with collectivization went a policy of dekulakization, in other words, expropriation of the kulaks, which was called, it was actually labeled liquidation of kulaks as a class. And it did not mean, as on the face of it, it might appear to mean, I'll discuss this a bit later on in the genocide paper, it did not mean kill all kulaks, although it is understandable that some local officials thought it did mean something like that. It means get rid of the class by expropriating them and kicking them out of the village, which is the source of their class position. And I think that brings me to the last point that I want to make. You have, or the second last point. So on the one hand, you have a society in which class labeling is a crucial social practice, but classes themselves are to some extent a state of flux and weakness, a sort of contradictory situation. You also have a situation in which people are often asked to identify themselves by class, and their documents do so identify themselves. Passports don't come till the early 30s, but when they do come, they have a class position thing. That the IDs that preceded them also identified you by class. Now, the fact that there were these formal processes of class identification means, of course, people are trying to cheat. People are trying to claim to have a more advantageous class membership. And that, as I said at the beginning of this talk, that can be, sometimes this is outright falsification, sometimes this is simply a sort of ingenious use of the materials presented to you. Now, one of my favorite examples, it involves, this is a real life case, one of thousands. It's the child of a poor peasant, a landless peasant, who works outside the village. And the family in the village is poor. There is a relative who is a more prosperous peasant, going to be called a kulak down the line. One of the daughters of the poor peasant family is sent to the cousins or the uncle, who is the rich peasant. And the relationship of this woman of this child, to her new family is ambiguous. On the one hand, perhaps she is a family member, but a poor relative. On the other hand, perhaps she is their batrak. Perhaps she is their laborer or domestic servant. And in the case, I came across this case because this woman's identification herself as a poor peasant was challenged by somebody who said, but she was actually brought up as a kulak. And as you can see, the real life circumstances are ambiguous. It is very hard to say, was she more a family member or was she more sort of help that didn't have to be paid? So the presentation of self involves quite a degree of masking, and masking brings with it unmasking. And if any of you have dealt with materials of the 1920s at all, you will have noticed how very great is the activity of unmasking people to show their true selves. In other words, somebody is getting up and saying, I speak for the poor peasantry, and I'm in the meeting, and I say, but you're not poor peasant, I know that you're a kulak. And you then have to try and make a comeback from that situation. And for young communists, young militant communists, challenging people's identity in this way was a crucial test of fire in a way. You know, it was where you developed your whole skills as a communist fighter. But the very last point I want to make has to do with the effect on a society of prevalent unmasking of people. In other words, what does it mean when the socialization for 10, 15 years of a whole group is, of a whole cohort of population, is to think people may not be what they seem to be. And my duties of a communist is actually to find out if they are or they are not. Now, you can see down the road things like enemies of the people. I look at you more carefully and I see you are really an enemy of the people. That's your real face. I'm unmasking the non-real face. But for a government, of course, that has all kinds of problems. In other words, some policies of the Soviet government produced whole classes of ex-something or others, ex-kulaks, ex-netmen, and so on, who collectively have a grievance against the Soviet regime. In other words, they are creating enemy classes. Now, it had never been clear to me to what degree they recognized that this was what was happening and that it was a problem. But there is a Stalin quotation, not a quotation really, it is paraphrased by the state prosecutor Nikolai Krylenko in 1934. He said, as Stalin said to me once, and this is what he said, how does the question of class enemies stand today? This is after de-kulakization, after collectivization. Where are the old exploiting classes, that is, landowners, capitalists, merchants? It seems there are none. Wrong. Those people exist. We did not physically destroy them, and they have remained with all their class sympathies, antipathies, traditions, habits, opinions, worldviews, and so on. The class enemy, despite the annihilation of the class of landlords, has remained in the person of living representatives of those former classes. And that, it seems to me, if we're thinking about Soviet political history and the remarkable capacity of the Soviet government, both to attract support and to create for itself enemies, this seems to me a prime example. So I think I'll leave it at that.
So, yeah, that's a chilling quote. That's quite amazing. Right now, because of the war in Ukraine, there's been a general move on the part of scholars to consider the question of decolonizing history, right? So people are now thinking about writing or rewriting the history of the Soviet Union, of the Russian Empire, of the present day, and so forth, in this new frame of looking at the periphery more seriously than people did in the past. And when this was promulgated at the last convention we had in Philadelphia of Slavicists, I was thinking, but wait, there were some of us who were decolonizing without knowing we were doing it some 50 years earlier. That is, we were interested in non-Russian peoples because most people were writing about Russia and didn't have any capacity to do research in Kazakh or Armenian or Georgian or whatever, because of the language problems. So I accidentally decided, because I hadn't prepared for a seminar at Columbia where I was a graduate student, I hadn't decided on what theme I would write my dissertation. And they were going around the table, we were supposed to have gotten it together. And so I'm thinking, what will I do? And I remembered there was this Armenian Bolshevik named Stepan Shaumyan. I think I'll write about him and the Baku Commune. That is the revolution in a city outside of mainstream Russia, and look at the question, and the subtitle of the book ultimately was Class and Nationality in the Russian Revolution. And so that was a theme that I was very interested in, and was interested in how people conceived of nationalities and class. Because again, you have to remember, this is the 1960s and 70s, in the midst of the Cold War. And during the Cold War, there was a very firm, well-articulated, anti-communist, anti-Soviet historiography, right? Dominated by certain figures from an older generation. And some of us, younger folks, and Sheila would have been one of them, and I and a number of others, thought we can rewrite this history or we can rethink it. And we were then labeled revisionists. And we were condemned as being soft on Soviets or pro-Soviet or pink or fellow travelers or whatever. But we had a great time. And ultimately, by the late 70s and 80s, those more conservative historians, Richard Pipes, let's say, Martin Malia, they thought we had conquered the profession. And they talked about it that way, that we had taken over.
But we had.
Yeah, we had momentarily, you're right. We had momentarily, and it was a very exciting time to be rewriting, rethinking. And I would say in terms of the politics, very few people in that generation were Marxists. Maybe there were 2 or 3 of us, but most were not Marxists. But they were good liberals, left liberals, etc. And they were basically détentistes. They were interested in thinking about another way of dealing with the Soviet Union, less confrontational, more about negotiation and understanding the complexities of that society. So that was the round politics. And then along came Gorbachev. I won't go into all that. We'll talk about that later. The Soviet Union collapsed, and the conservatives had their day again. And suddenly Richard Pipes and Martin Malia and all of those who had said this is an awful experiment in human degradation, they won out. Now, my interest was always the non-Russian peoples and Soviet nationality policy, which I found quite extraordinary, right? What they tried to do, what they managed to succeed to do, and what they failed to do. And Soviet nationality policy was a product of a very complex relationship between ideology, that is their own Marxist understanding. And by the way, there's no single Marxism or simple way of saying this is what Marxists think, because two Marxists fight to the death on their definition of what that might be. But anyway, they were developing points of view. And the Bolsheviks were very divided, Lenin's party, on what to do with the national question. There were left Bolsheviks, I'd say Bukharin and Pyatakov and some others, who were opposed to any concessions to non-Russians, to the idea of nationality, to the idea of nationalism. And then there were I guess you could say on the right, there were national Bolsheviks or national communists who believed that there had to be some kind of accommodation. And then there was Lenin, and Lenin's view at the beginning would be the one that would prevail. And Lenin had a very complex and mixed idea about what he was about and what would happen. And some of these ideas I find perplexing and hard to believe, but Lenin's position was something like this. Take nationalism and nationality seriously. We are in a bourgeois democratic, bourgeois capitalist period of history. Nations are not about to disappear. They will prevail for a while, and we have to make kind of strategic, tactical alliances with this phenomenon, okay? So we have to be much more pragmatic. And you know what? Always think of me as Lenin now. I have the beard. Anyway, so Lenin would say something like, I think nationalism is the product of imperialism. It's that because the Russian government, the great chauvinists, etc., have dominated and repressed non-Russians, that nationalism has developed as a result. We're going to show them that we're tolerant, that we're going to support their national cultural interests, that we're going to give them autonomy of all kinds, etc., and together we'll build socialism. And he believed that if, in fact, you made those kinds of concessions, nationalism would die down. Now, ultimately, there would also be a point, because nationalism was a kind of, he wouldn't have used those words, but a kind of false consciousness. It was a misunderstanding of what reality was about, that classes were far more relevant, far more real than this idea of nations, which were about harmony of social differences rather than confrontation and conflict between these social strata. So this was their position. And so almost immediately, they decided, pragmatically, because before the revolution they didn't have this position, that the Bolsheviks would create a federal state. That was already a concession to the actual fact that because of the weakness of the revolutionary state through 1917, nationalities were going their own way, were being promoted by foreign armies, right? By the Germans particularly, who were supporting nationalists in the Baltic countries, in Belarus, in Ukraine, and so forth. And so there was a reality to deal with, that there was this kind of centrifugal force in the revolution in World War I, as nationalism was being promoted by these various forces. And so we're going to make a federal state in which there'll be units based on nationality. So there'll be an Armenian Soviet Republic, a Georgian, a Ukrainian, a Belarusian, etc. And then there'll be a Russian large federated Soviet Republic. And that will tolerate, in fact, promote national cultures and ultimately national cadres. That is, the ruling communist parties will be made up of these non-Russian peoples. The problem was there weren't that many communists who were Kazakh or Azerbaijani or many of the Muslim nationalities and others. So you'd have to create them. And if you go and look at who was actually the party chiefs in the 1920s in Kazakhstan, for instance, it was a man named Mirzoyev, who was an Armenian. Or in some other republics, there would be Russians. Because they didn't, Kirov was the head of the party in Azerbaijan for a while. And then some Armenian, imagine an Armenian was the head of the party in Azerbaijan. So it was a kind of strange situation. But there was this, I think, genuine thrust of trying to create some social base in these non-Russian republics for the Bolshevik power. And these concessions were made. And one of the biggest one was the teaching of these languages. They were going to teach people in these languages. In fact, minority languages to the point that there would be Kurdish schools for Kurds in Armenia or Azerbaijan. That there would be Mingrelian schools. Mingrelian is a kind of Georgian dialect. Mingrelians wanted to have their own recognition as an independent nationality. That wasn't granted, but still, there was such a thing. Jews would have their own, not only schools and theaters, but they'd have their own autonomous oblasts or autonomous. And this was a colossal project which must have cost a huge amount of energy and was very difficult to implement. And it was a vociferous process. It was, again, a centrifugal process that would lead people in various directions. Now, not everyone held onto that process. Let's say there was a very important Georgian communist named Avel Yenukidze. He had been, in some ways, Stalin's teacher early in his revolutionary career. And Yenukidze thought, we've gone too far. We've given too much. Again, he was a kind of left Bolshevik, or at least on this issue. We've given too much. And we have to clamp down, and we have to, because Belarusians, by the way, were complaining, actually in the 1920s, that they were being forced to learn Belarusian, when it was much more convenient if you learned Russian and your children could then succeed better in this new Soviet Union that you had. But they very much pushed this nationalization process, which was called in Russian korenizatsiya, or indigenization, or rooting, or nationalization, or whatever you want to call it, korenizatsiya. By the way, at one point, let's say late in the Soviet period, I asked some friends, good communists, about korenizatsiya, and they said, what's that word? They had never heard of the word. The word disappeared with, in some sense, the policy itself. It was gone from Soviet dictionaries and Soviet discourse by the 1970s and 1980s. But it was genuinely implemented. Now, if you have such a korenizatsiya policy, you will then create cadres who are what you can call national Bolsheviks or national communists. And this particularly became something that Stalin, once Lenin died, 1924, January, and he became more and more prominent as the authority, not only on nationalism and nationality, but on other things. As Stalin developed his power, he became more and more fearful of this tendency toward national communism. Early on in the 20s, he fought again. I mean, one of his followers, Sultan Galiyev, he actually purged and dealt with rather harshly. But most importantly, around the end of the 20s and end of the 30s, he began to clamp down on this idea of national communism, national Bolshevism. I won't go into detail, but if you read Terry Martin's wonderful book, Affirmative Action Empire, and he was a student at Chicago when we were there and wrote this brilliant prize-winning book. In fact, the turning point is roughly around 1931. Now, late in the 20s and early 30s, the Soviet Union was extremely vulnerable. It was fearful of the possibility of war, right, with powerful countries in the West. Powerful countries like Britain, who's still the most powerful country in the world, and Poland, right? We don't think of Poland as that powerful, but there was fear of these kinds of things. And so there's a policy that Stalin will begin to move that doesn't end Korenizatsiya, it doesn't end this trend, but begins to emphasize, and I think largely because of this fear of war and the need to prepare for the coming war, in increasing centralization, increasing the study of Russian, increasing the arming of the country, etc. When, in fact, did the Soviet Union actually pass a law making Russian mandatory for non-Russians? 1938. That is 10 years, 11 years after the coming to power. In other words, that's how seriously this policy was taken. Well, in the 1930s, I will be very general here, there's a crackdown on these national Bolsheviks. Every single one of national republic leaderships is decimated in the Great Purges, except two. One is Georgia with Beria, who runs to Moscow to tell Stalin, you know, we're okay, we're doing this thing, we're purging our national communists, etc. And his satrap, Bagirov, in Azerbaijan. Otherwise, they're all wiped out, including that Mirzoyev that I mentioned, who was a good communist. If you were a good communist, you were likely to be killed by Stalin at some point. Before the war, before the invasion from Hitler, Stalin killed more communists than anyone else in history. So there's this more repressive, more centralized, denationalizing policy. And then maybe a little later in the questions, I'll talk about the post-Stalin period. And I hope in this seminar we can talk something about the post-Stalin period, because the years from 1953 to the end of the Soviet Union in 1991 are actually longer than the period from 1917 to 1953. And yet it's the least studied. Of course, for us in our generation, there was no period like that, or not much of it, and certainly no scholarship. And that's a very important period of greater tolerance and understanding and a renationalization of the republics, which will lead ultimately to the collapse of the Soviet Union.
Thank you very much, Professor Suny.